what you say has far greater implications than the average person because there are consequences to your words. If you're a public figure in any capacity, you have a responsibility for your behavior and the consequences that it leads to.
Srinivas Rao is an author, blogger, entrepreneur, and host of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, which is one of the top shows in the world. And his book, Unmistakable, Why Only is Better Than Best, is fast becoming a top recommendation of mine right after Napoleon Hill's book.
When you think about sort of personal development or aspirational media, we don't like to take into account context and how context literally determines outcomes in virtually every area of our lives. Context changes the probability of your ability to achieve something. So like given my physique and my genetics, I am never going to play in the NBA, no matter how many damn self-help books I read, no matter how hard I work on the court. Like this just never going to happen. Yes, you can be, do, and have anything you want within the range of what you are capable of at the highest level. And that's the problem with a lot of this is that
an odd first question, perhaps, but when I read your stuff, I wondered this: in your quest to be unmistakable in your life, how much does death play a role? The idea of your own mortality on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis.
So mortality is one of those weird concepts, right? Like I think we all inherently know we're going to die, and there's that James Dean quote, right? It's like, like dream as if you'll live forever, but live as if you'll die tomorrow. And that's a bit absurd. Like, because if you take that quite literally, like think about it. If I knew I was going to die tomorrow, you think I'd be sitting here talking to you or doing any work? I would basically be like, all right, let me go do the most hedonistic, like destructive possible things that I could do. Like just seek as much pleasure as possible. And just, like maximize pleasure over satisfaction because I'm going to be dead tomorrow anyway. So I would literally be like, all right, what's every drug I've ever wanted to try? Like just go buck wild. That's what most people would do if they literally knew they were going to die tomorrow. So I always thought that idea was kind of absurd, but I had a revision on that idea, which was to, dream as if you'll live forever, but live as if you'll die within a year, because if you're going to live as if you'll die within a year, then you start to actually think about, what is possible within that time frame, right? And a lot of the original impetus for the book that you read was the first self-published version called The Art of Being Unmistakable. And in that book, I posed a question, like, I said, like, if I look back at the last 6 months of my life and I knew that, the rest of, like, that the end of the year, that this would be the end, would I be happy with how I lived my life? I'm paraphrasing. And the answer was no. It was very clearly no, because I was like, wow, I'm really just kind of holding back in terms of the way I'm writing, in terms of the way I'm speaking. I am basically trying to cater to the whims of the internet and the irony of all of that, right? Considering what the message is about. And so when I started writing in a way that was like really raw and just like honest and unfiltered and, talking about the things I was like, these are the things I thought I should never share publicly. And like, we'll come back to that because I think there is actually a line that you have to be very wary of crossing, particularly as you become more and more known as a public figure. But I realized, I was like, I am kind of sugarcoating like the reality that I want to share. And so I just started like writing these ridiculously long Facebook status updates, whatever, all of which eventually led to the self-published version of the book, which became a Wall Street Journal bestseller. And then the book that you read, which was the result of the Wall Street Journal bestseller, a book deal. So to answer your question, does death play a role? Like, no, not really. Like, I'm not sitting here thinking about mortality. Like, yeah, it's there in the back of my mind, but I don't know. Like, but I remember for the longest time, like there were times when I would tell my friend, I was like, I think I'm going to die young. Like that's why I have to like do all this crazy shit before that happens. I mean, I don't know how true that is, but there was this like, idea of that being a possibility, but no, I mean, I like day to day, no.
In 2014, you hit your depths, from what I read, to the point where you even contemplated suicide. Your business was failing. Things weren't going the way you wanted to. You were withdrawing socially. You were deeply depressed, not sleeping. In that regard, was that a necessary gift for you, death, the idea of death in that time for you to kind of pull yourself out of it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, like that time was miserable. Like I don't think I've ever been more miserable in my life. And also it was necessary for me to grow and evolve as a human being because like the thing, looking back now, I realize a lot of that was through my own doing. Like that was me not like, it's hard to take responsibility for the shit that just falls apart. But the reality is that like you play a role in everything that happens, good and bad, right? And Jerry Colonna poses this question: how have I been complicit in creating these conditions? And the truth is, I was like, I made choices that led to that place. Like I was not emotionally mature enough to handle one, the sort of like level of success I'd experienced the year prior, and also like the, like going from being in the spotlight to like fading and seeming like I was fading into oblivion, which is why I'm always like very, very wary of moments in the spotlight. Like they mean nothing to me anymore because I'm like, these are dangerous in my mind. Like it's like, okay, cool, you got to write a book. I'm like, yeah, but the 2 years that went into writing the book are what matter. Like even when I was on reality TV, it was just like, okay, this is done and over with. Like, for a lot of those people, this was like their moment in life. To me, I was like, this is like a inflection point on a much bigger journey. Like, I don't want to be known for this, even though millions of people saw it. And I was just like, okay, so in that sense, I'm very wary of being like just seduced by the spotlight because it's all just a giant sideshow, right? The real thing is in the work. Everything is about the work itself. That's actually all that matters. That's all that anybody cares about. And the truth is that like you want to produce work that provides value for other people. That all depends on you doing the work. It has nothing to do with the attention you get. You know, uh,
Yeah, I do.
attention is really seductive and flattering, and it can be really dangerous if you're not careful in terms of how you handle it.
The concept I think you covered recently with a guest of yours is the arrival fallacy.
Yeah.
I've heard that, hadn't heard the term before, but man, it made a lot of sense to me. My the reason why I ended up leaving a big corporate job was because the big gig that I got, I thought was the moment of fulfillment when it was really the moment of misery. When you said
Hmm.
that you had the heights of success, which were followed by a big fall, the 2014 depths that you went to, what was the
Hmm.
arrival fallacy that you had at that moment? What exactly had happened where you felt that
Well,
you had
okay, so
arrived?
the funny thing is that like the arrival fallacy is not something that just happens once. It happens over and over again
Yeah.
at every single sort of milestone that you think. Right? So like initially it was like, oh, I just wanted to sell 1,000 copies of a self-published book. And I remember the editor who edited that book, unfortunately I had a falling out with her after everything, but she told me, she was like, don't forget the guy who was happy to sell 300 copies. And I was like, yeah, of course. And like, I totally forgot that guy. So, and it's funny because like, at that time that was the height of success. Now it's like, I like sometimes forget like when people are like, oh, Srinivas Rao, Wall Street Journal bestselling author. I was like, right, I am a Wall Street Journal bestselling author. And I don't think that appears like the only reason I think it appears anywhere in any bio like is usually on a sales page solely for copywriting and persuasive purposes. Other than that, like I've had friends like, how is this not mentioned? Like literally people have seen it and they're like, how is this not mentioned anywhere? Even my brother-in-law called it out when I was on Indian matchmaking. He was like, you totally downplayed like what you did as a career. He said like, you just said you're the host of a podcast and you do public speaking. He was like, that is like a very, and I did that intentionally because I was like, all right, I don't want to be judged based on my accomplishments. I want somebody to see me for my character. But yeah, so like for me, the first arrival fallacy was like, oh, like I have now like had this sold out event. I met a girl who I like really liked. Things didn't work out with her. So basically, then I hit this low point. Then, by I think it was 2015 when I got my book deal. So there's the next arrival fallacy, right? It's like, oh, I got a book deal. Like, the thing that every blogger was craving, and not only a book deal, but like like a six-figure book deal with Penguin Portfolio, which is basically the home of people like Ryan Holiday and Seth Godin. And it's like, wait, I'm now one of these people. Fast forward like 8 months, I'm like, now I'm the redheaded stepchild of the imprint because I'm nowhere as near as successful as any of these guys. Uh, and so you constantly keep coming across that, right? Like, and so there's this like constant tension between ambition and fulfillment that I think is really one of the things that is just the nature of doing anything entrepreneurial or creative. Like, and the more that you are driven by external motivators, the worse shit gets. Because you can keep chasing and chasing and chasing until you get to the top of the mountain, only to realize that wait a minute, like this is a false horizon. Like it was Ed Holmes, the actor, from The Hangover, and I quoted this in the book. I said, I remember that always stayed with me. It's like, here's the guy at the top, like he was at the height of his career at post Hangover movies. Like you go everywhere, you go, people recognize you. You're like, oh, you're the guy from the Hangover movie. Like I'm a nobody in the grand scheme of things. Um, but that always stayed with me. It's like, and he said, life is a series of false horizons. And I think that, the arrival fallacy, it causes us to chase these false horizons, uh, often without knowing why, deluded into the ideas that we will be happy and fulfilled when we get there, only to realize that like right over the horizon, there is another mountain to climb and another mountain to climb. And I think that there, part of it is just making peace with that there's always going to be another level. There's always going to be another mountain to climb. And the question is like, how do I pursue climbing the other mountain while enjoying the fact that I have actually made it to the top of this one? I'm not saying that's easy. Like if I had answers, like if I had the answer to this, I probably wouldn't have done 1,000 interviews. Um, and so, like I, I always like joke like I'm pretty much just battling out my own demons with the people that I interview. It's like I'm trying to wrestle with these issues myself, um, because I think that there's this idea that somebody like me or some person who's on my podcast is like an expert in their field and has all these answers. And people will come to me and ask me for life advice. And half the time I'm like, I have no fucking idea. I was like, I have these same problems that you're asking me about. Like, I don't know
Yeah.
what to tell you. Like, and so like, I've said this a lot before. I was like, I always says like, you know, you should always consider the possibility that everything I'm telling you is bullshit, because it may very well be in the context of your own life. And I think that's true for advice from anybody, not just me. And that's one of the bigger issues with the way we deal with prescriptive advice is we treat it as gospel and not guidance, and we treat it as a formula instead of a framework. And I like it. Part of why I have such a diversity of guests is because I like to mix and match pieces. Like this is, I think I may have wrote this in the book, is you want to mix other people's ingredients to come up with your own recipes,
Yeah.
not like use their recipe, because you can't. Like you're the one variable that will throw off all of that inevitably.
100%. The question I'll ask it this way, because this is a fear of mine as I, I'm a big believer in having a clear vision. You mentioned the why. I believe that's tied
Mm-hmm.
into the why. Like, hey, this is what I want for my life. So that's my vision. Obviously, goals are important to most of us, some sort of goal. But I do fear not allowing the lessons of the last arrival fallacy to prevent the next one. And like you said, you struggle with the same thing. But the benefit of podcasting, one of the biggest benefits, two of them, are one, the relationships you build, and two, the knowledge that you
Mm-hmm.
do gain. So I guess I'll ask it this way: of the guests you've interviewed, of the stories you've heard, of the advice or impactful rhetoric that you've taken in the years and years you've done the podcast, are there
Yeah.
any individuals or any individual pieces of advice that you've heard that have been the best in terms of tactically how not to fall into the arrival fallacy? The key to life, it isn't money, it's happiness. And when you measure how happy you are, you actually become even more happy. Our friends at Gobundance, the tribe of millionaires, use a very specific tool to measure their happiness. It's called the Life Happiness Index, and you can have it too. Go over to gobundance.com/LHI and take your Life Happiness Index assessment. You'll rate yourself in multiple categories on exactly how happy you are and get a custom output for you specifically that you can use in developing whatever goals you have for your life. Gobundance is the tribe of healthy, wealthy, generous people who choose to live epic lives. And the tool Gobundance members use at the base of all of that is the Life Happiness Index. Get out there and grab life big.
Well, okay. So I don't know that any one of them necessarily is specifically about the arrival fallacy, but I will tell you this: like my mentor, Greg Hartle, um, was, like he was not unwilling to give people a harsh dose of reality. And because the thing is, like, so many of these podcasts, like, and a lot of the personal development and aspirational media is feel good fluff. It makes you feel good, but it doesn't lead to any real change. And often and I wrote this somewhere, it's like what you want to hear feels good, what you need to hear is good, and what you need to hear is unpleasant often. I only know this because Greg like rode my ass, like especially in the 2014 moment. He was like, "You're acting like a damn teenager." He didn't have like, it wasn't like he wasn't coddling me. He wasn't like, "Oh, it'll be okay." He pretty much tore me a new asshole every day, and I deserved it because I was acting like a child. And he literally said, he's like, dude, you are a public figure. He said, this is like not inspiring. And he was like, and you got to take this into account. And I remember I said, yeah, Greg, but I'm human too. And he said, you know what, Srini, you don't get to make that excuse. And that was like the ultimate sort of wake up call. And he's right. You don't get to make that excuse. When you're a public figure who has any semblance of an audience, yeah, you have personal problems. Yeah, you have issues. But guess what? That is not your audience's problem, and you don't get to make that excuse. There is an expectation of how you should show up in the world. Um, and what's meant to be behind closed doors should stay behind closed doors. And that's like a really hard balancing act, right? Because like there's all this talk about authenticity and vulnerability, but the that's so nuanced and we don't quite understand it. Because here's the thing, like in the public eye, like why do we follow public figures? One, like, when we buy a self-help book, it's because you want the author to solve your problem. You don't give a shit about theirs. Like, I don't give a damn about Simon Sinek finding his why. I bought his book so I can find mine, and I don't think like if Simon thinks other people give a damn about him finding his why, he's wrong, right? Like the truth is we're all like driven by self-interest to a degree, right? And the thing is that like people who are very good at what they do understand how to cater to other people's self-interest. Probably nobody is better at this than Ramit Sethi. And like I bought 3 of his courses, and every one of his courses has led to tangible results. Like every single, like, so when I see something that I know will help me, I'll buy it because I've never, like even his copywriting course was like $2,000. And like, I think we made $24,000 in the first launch after using those ideas. I was like, okay, done. This thing paid for itself. Like it's paid for itself probably 100 times over at this point. But the thing is, he's very, very mindful about how he caters to other people's interest while at the same time being authentic and interesting. So like in the public eye, like a lack of confidence, like whining about your problems is repelling, like it just is. And that's like I wrote this really lengthy article on Medium titled The Psychology of Building an Audience. And I based it on a lot of research. We did a guy named Steve Goldstein who talked about how the most powerful people in the world, from Washington to Wall Street to Hollywood, make themselves likable. And a lot of this has to do with how they portray themselves, right? Like if you're the president of the United States, whether Donald Trump understands this or not, like what you say has far greater implications than the average person, because there are consequences to your words. And
Sure.
if you're a public figure in any capacity, you have a responsibility for your behavior and the consequences that it leads to. A lot of people like don't love that idea, because and the thing is that you don't really realize that until you fuck it up a few times. And the thing is that if you're dumb about it, it can literally be the undoing of a career. Like, I mean, you see this with athletes who are like famous and they get themselves involved in some scandal. They lose all their sponsorship deals, like all of that. Like those kinds of things in the public eye can be detrimental to your career.
So if you
And I
make a
realize I've gone off on a tangent
No,
from
no,
your
that's okay.
original
If
question.
you make a choice to be a public figure in any way, you're a podcaster, a blogger, a YouTuber, an influencer, whatever it might be, if somebody does, is vulnerability not an attractive trait? Hey, here's not only my highs. I don't want to shine up the pig here, but I'm going to show you some of the warts as well. And if so, how do you leverage it such
All right.
that you can maintain,
So this is
an
this is
inspirational
a
poise?
very good question, right? So the thing is that the person that taught me this was Danielle Laporte, and she had a really good way of doing this. She's like, I don't ever talk or write about an experience until I'm done processing it, so that then the lessons are valuable. And so it's really about being of service to your audience, not seeking pity from them, right? And like I've had moments where even my family members have called me out. Like I remember I wrote this article about like my addiction to achievement and how it's nearly destroyed me. And my sister like read it, and she's like, you shouldn't publish shit like this. You know why? She was like, people hire you to speak, and this kind of shit doesn't inspire them. And she was spot on. Like she wasn't wrong about that. And so the thing is, like, it takes a lot of self-awareness to get to this point. But back to my mentor Greg, like in terms of the sort of real practical advice, part of why I appreciated him was that he didn't like sugarcoat like reality or sell people on false hopes, like everybody can do this and everybody can do whatever. He's like, when you think about sort of personal development or aspirational media, we don't like to take into account context and how context literally determines outcomes in virtually every area of our lives. So like if you think about context, right? So for example, I'm a scrawny Indian, context number one. Context changes the probability of your ability to achieve something. So like given my physical like my physique and my genetics, I am never going to play in the NBA, no matter how many damn self help books I read, no matter how hard I work on the court. Like, this just never going to happen. Nobody likes that idea. And the truth is, when we like that, sort of motivational bullshit phrase, it's like you can be, do, and have anything you want. It's like, no, you cannot. Like, yes, you can be, do, and have anything you want within the range of what you are capable of at the highest level. And none of that gets taken into account in a lot of the way we talk about this stuff. Like, people hate the idea of genetic determinism in self improvement, but I am sorry, genetics determine plenty. You know what? Like, they do. Like, you
They
can't
have to.
argue with that. Like,
Yeah.
science proves that, like, and again, like, background, upbringing, like, so let's take another example of this context idea. Let's look at two examples: David Goggins and 50 Cent. David
Mm.
Goggins wrote that book, right? That, like, everybody loves, and it's a fantastic book. It's really well written. And like, somebody had asked me this about that book, and I was like, well, of course David Goggins is tough as fucking nails. Go look at what he's been through. You are not going to become that way by reading his book if you are like a civilian who has never spent time in those environments. Or take 50 Cent, right? 50 Cent is like a straight up hustler from the hood. If you didn't grow up in the hood, like, there's lessons to learn from that. But like, the upbringing that 50 Cent had versus me, who grew up in a fairly upper middle class area, and my dad's a college professor, like, that context is so wildly different. And so, like, I mean, 50 Cent was smarter than the average person too. But like, if you put somebody like me in that same environment, it's very likely I could have succumbed to that environment, become a product of that environment, simply because of that background. So we have to take context into account when it comes to everything. Like, context matters so much, yet we're completely blind to it when we talk about all this stuff.
Does that at all broach or go too far into the point of excusing somebody from achieving their highest self-actualization, whatever that is
No,
for them?
no, not at all. So here's the thing. Like, I'm not saying that that is an excuse. I think that, like, I think there's a lot of delusional optimism, right? It's like these people who sit around making vision boards and, like, mentally masturbating to the idea that one day they'll be rich. But it's like, well, no, like, you don't go talk to somebody who's actually rich. Do you think Elon Musk sat around making vision boards? Probably not. He just went out and started building shit. And that's the problem with a lot of this, is that it basically, it's a really good substitute for doing any actual real work, even though it feels like work, but it's not. It was
Yeah.
like, there's this, like, I have a friend who did Landmark, and she was like, oh, like, we talk about this idea, have you done the work? And I'm like, done the work? Like, I'm like, that's like, what kind of, it's like, look, I think I have a podcast that would qualify as personal development, but I also think that, their personal development needs to be scrutinized and questioned and, like, examined in detail, which is why I do what I do, because I just don't think there's any point to, like, filling people's ears with nothing but inspirational nonsense. In fact, one of my favorite iTunes reviews we ever got was that there is no feel good fluff here. And I was like, that meant the
You
world
hit
to
it.
me. That
Yeah.
to me was like the supreme compliment. Because, like, the other thing is, like, yeah, you'll piss people off. So um so yeah, I'm not saying that that excuses people, and there are a lot of people who will just use that as an excuse. But the thing is, like, give you one more example of this. Like, me and my sister are wildly different people. She's a doctor. She's like every Indian parent's dream come true. I'm every Indian parent's nightmare come true. Um, but it took me a long time. Like, I had the biggest inferiority complex about her over the longest time, and then I realized, I was like, wait, she could never do what I do. Like, not like she, like, the willingness to forgo stability, all that. Like, there are certain things that, like, and she's exceptional at, that, I wouldn't be able to hold a candle to her at, and vice versa. Like, she's able to basically follow a plan to the letter, because med school is like a scripted plan. Like, exactly what to do. Being an entrepreneur is far from that. Like, it's every day you're just making it up as you go along.
Yeah, one of the reasons I really resonated with your book, and I say this all the time, people ask me often about, how did I quit my job? What are the steps, if you will? And I always
Yeah.
say it. It's like, okay, well, uniquely me. Start a real estate meetup group that turns into like a mastermind community. Start a podcast. Have a real estate investment business that you partner up with a guy that you met at an event, and then move to the Dominican because your wife's from there. Like, there's no steps to do me. I had to do me. That's the unmistakable aspect. So what I love about what you write about is I think you lean into this concept that, hey, look, proximity is power. Get around good people, have a good support group, and find your path to unmistakable. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that that is fair. Like like of course, like who you surround yourself with matters, and the thing is that like you'd be amazed by who it is that can do extraordinary things. Like my mentor Greg, who was by far the most influential person on where I've ended up. He had 150 followers on Twitter when I met him, and was 6 weeks into some project that he was working on. Like that was a blog. He was a nobody, you know.
Mm.
And as far as like if you look up Greg Hartle, you're not going to find much because he destroyed his online presence after he was done with his project. He was like, as far as the internet is concerned, it's very difficult to find any information about him. And I think that you have to be very careful about perceived status versus real people who can actually help you.
No, that makes sense. Now, your mission really is, I've heard this in the book, like pretty much help people live their best lives, right? And a lot of people they resonate with that mission. I know it can sound cliche. I have the
Yeah.
same thing. People ask me like, yeah, look, if I can inspire somebody to live their best life, that's meaningful to me. So I get that. But I want to ask in terms of, how do you, let's ask it this way. What is one concept, one step, one something that somebody needs to understand in order to unlock the ability to be unmistakable in that quest? If somebody wants to inspire and motivate others, what is a
Mhm.
concept of unmistakable that they need to know if they got nothing else from this podcast? They need to understand this key concept to becoming unmistakable in order to achieve that mission.
I'll tell you what, for me, it has been the driving force, and it's curiosity and experimentation, right? With no regard for how things will turn out. Like people always ask how I choose my guests. I'm like, entirely based on personal curiosity, nothing else. Like that is it. And that's why book publicists hate me, because they don't have, like, there's no way you can get through our filter. Like if you try to pitch the podcast from our contact form, it's like the most obnoxious contact form ever. It basically, if you say you've never listened to one of our episodes, it redirects you to a page that says, "Sorry, we don't accept people who've never listened to the show." And it was literally a filtering mechanism, but there's a grain of truth to it. And also, like we also like have very clear guidelines to say if you miss any detail here, we will actually delete the pitch. And P.S. If this is all a pain in the ass, you can blame, you know, David Lee Roth, because the Van Halen M&M story, right? The brown M&Ms. I was like, this is our way of filtering. So the thing about that is that, like, I think that that's one of the harder things. Like, I remember people tried to ask me to teach a course on Unmistakable or turn that book into a course. That book was impossible to turn into a course, because, like, I was like, you're asking me for like a roadmap, and that's like that's the antithesis of the book. So I think the overarching sort of idea is like the more that you experiment, the more that you follow your curiosity, the more you're going to discover one, what you find engaging. And if you find something engaging, you're much more likely to stick with it. Like people are like, "Are you passionate about podcasts?" I was like, "No, I don't even listen to podcasts." Like I discovered this by accident. And so like I realized, I was like, oh, I actually find the process of doing this thing engaging. And so you kind of go from curiosity to engagement to, competence to expertise to mastery. Like that's kind of the way I see this flows. And in that, you will start to develop sort of your own sort of flair and style. And that's where unmistakable starts to come in. Like like I said, if it was like a blueprint, like how to become unmistakable, I wrote a book about this, and I wouldn't know how to write that as a blog post, because it's
Yeah.
like nonsensical to even think about that as, a formulaic prescription, because it's not at all.
You've
And
essentially
I
laid
think,
out a flow state. Stephen Kotler talks about this. I believe he says
yeah,
flow, the first trigger is curiosity, and his are different
yeah,
than what you laid out. It wasn't a copy of what he said, but it's the same sort of
totally.
thing. And when you say it that way, actually, it makes a lot of sense to me. Unmistakable means, I mean, in many ways, authentic. Who you are, how you represent yourself to the world is unmistakably you, which is
Yeah.
akin to being in flow, wouldn't you say?
There's a lot of overlap, I would say, for sure. I mean, and Steven's work definitely has influenced mine for sure. Like I've had him as a guest multiple times, and even been to his Zero to Dangerous seminar. If you like do a search for reviews of Zero to Dangerous, my blog comes up as the second result. Um, so yeah, there is definitely a grain of truth to that. Like I think that, like I said, it's really like, I was able to define unmistakable because you had to for a book, but to like really make it, sort of concrete. Like it's really in a lot of ways an abstract idea where it's like what makes somebody unmistakable. You'll know it when you see it. Like it's as simple as that, right? Like there are certain musicians where you can hear one chord, or like 30 seconds of a song. You're like, okay, I know who wrote that.
I
And,
completely agree. I always use. I'm a big Buffalo Bills fan. If I have one passion,
yeah,
it's my Buffalo Bills, and I've been long suffering. But in the last few years, we got this guy, Josh Allen, as the quarterback. And people say, I always make this reference. If Josh Allen and, Mac Jones, who's the quarterback for the awful, terrible, worst franchise in history, New England Patriots, and has nowhere near the physical skill of a Josh Allen. If
Bob Kraft might disagree with you on this,
I don't
right?
care about Bob Kraft. I lived in Boston for a number of years through the worst of the years for the Bills. So screw the Patriots. Fuck that whole town. Actually, I love Boston, but fuck that town. But my point is, if you were to look at a stat line after some games, it might look similar. Yardage,
Hmm.
completion percentage, number of touchdowns, number of interceptions might look similar. But if you watch the game, there's an eyeball test. Like, okay, I get that the stat line looks the same, but you can't compare that to that physically. The types of throws being made, the movement in the pocket, all of that. That what you
Yeah.
just said makes me think of the eyeball test they call it in football or sports. So
Hmm.
that's I don't know. That's what resonates for me. I want to
Yeah.
jump into your sport, which is surfing. And there's
Yeah.
this concepts that you break down in the book and throughout a lot of your writing and a lot of what you do. One of them is called the drop. And I'm not a
Hmm.
surfer, but I'm gonna try to I'm gonna try to explain what the drop is as I explain it. If you're I could picture a big wave and you need to kind of go vertically down into the wave in order to then go horizontally along it, right? That
Yep.
that vertical movement from the top to the bottom of the wave, if you will, is the drop. And you
Hmm.
talk about it in terms of in entrepreneurship, the drop, the bigger the drop, the bigger the potential reward. The more scary it is to do, quitting the job or whatever it might be, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Where in your life right now, or what in your life right now has you in the drop? Or where do you need to go in the drop and you haven't because of fear?
Well, okay, so I wouldn't say I haven't gone there because of fear. So like one thing that I like long was clear about was that I never wanted to be defined by any one endeavor, whether it be a book or a podcast. And like I came to terms with the fact that my life as a published author is pretty much over. Like I'm not going to get another book deal, like barring some sort of crazy
Why?
well, one, I don't have the numbers. Like so here's the other thing. This is like a harsh reality check for people, right? Like all these things are businesses, whether you like it or not. Just because the company sells art, it doesn't mean they're immune to the rules of capitalism, right? Book deals, like you're like getting your book deal is contingent on like your potential demand for your first book, and then based on that demand, like based on how well they sell, that'll determine whether you get another one. So like my life as a published author writing books for a published publisher is probably over. And very a lot of us get tied to an identity that keeps us stuck, where you'll see this where people are like, they can't move on because they're so tied to that identity. Like this happens to athletes when their careers end, right? Like they don't know what to do with themselves because they haven't thought it through. So being said, it's like so my primary area, like I even though I'm still running Unmistakable, like part of the reason all of this came about was because of trying to manage Unmistakable Creative. Like I've been doing a ton of work around AI, like workflow research, like how to optimize workflows. Like I'm literally working right now on inside of the note taking app Mem, like working on simulating human employees like within Unmistakable. So like I literally had ChatGPT write a job description for a content strategist with a goal of like increasing subscribers, traffic and listeners. And then I went into Mem, which has a chat layer that uses your own knowledge. Now keep in mind, I have like probably 10 to 15,000 notes inside of Mem, including podcast transcripts. And I literally went to Mem and I was like, okay, I want you to be my content strategist. Like I told the chat, like if you saw this interaction, it would look ridiculous. And I was like, so let's start with one. What information do I need to have in Mem in order for you to do this job? These are your job responsibilities. So literally, I've been building that out. So like we started a course called Maximize Your Output with Mem, which basically the purpose of it really was to look at, so if you look at knowledge workers in general, and this ties to creativity in a lot of ways because it ties to attention, which takes us into flow. The root cause of pretty much every one of our problems when it comes to knowledge work is how we manage and organize information. If you think about it, right? Like think about how many different tools you need to complete all these different tasks, how many people are involved in all the different places where the information you need to deal with on a day-to-day basis lives. Now imagine what would be like if all that information was centralized. You didn't have to spend any time creating folders or remember where anything is, and it was all interconnected, meaning you could make connections between different ideas. And on top of that, you had an AI assistant that could retrieve knowledge for you, that could synthesize it for you, that could generate ideas. I mean, it's effectively like having a Jarvis enabled second brain, like on steroids. I mean, you literally are like Iron Man. And that's what I've been. And so we have a course called Maximize Your Output. Like, so I've been building that. And so part of that, like, and that's also been evolving because as I started building that out, I realized I was like, more people are coming to me to ask for like, like I'd been doing just like, I'll talk to somebody after I get off the phone with them and I'll say, hey, let me show you a couple of things. I had, an author that I'd reached out to because I loved her book and I wanted to give her some book marketing advice. And she was recently a guest, but, we got to talking and as I was going through the ideas I was like, well, here, let me show you some of what what you can do with AI to manage all of this, because I know some of this is time consuming. And she was like, holy shit. uh she's like, you know what, forget this. She's like, just how do I hire you? And at that point, like, we hadn't even built a website yet for this. And so I have a but so it was kind of funny is like we signed several clients before even building a website, which is actually the way you should do it.
Agreed.
And so really at this point, like, I'm because the thing is, you got to realize also for somebody like me, like having AI was like giving me, I told my friend, I was like, this is like, I've been sitting on this information gold mine and somebody handed me a pickaxe finally. And he's like, no, they handed you an automated pickaxe. Because you think about 1,000 podcast transcripts, like, that, like I can repurpose content at a scale and speed like never before.
Yeah.
So now the challenge is figuring out what to do with all this. But it's like, I realize there are a lot of people who fear the impact that this will have on creativity, and I think that is actually the exact opposite. I think if you're bad at what you do, then yes, but if you're good at what you do, AI is not going to touch that. What it's going to do is enable you to do those things better and faster. It's like I said, I was like, AI isn't going to turn idiots into geniuses. It's going to make smart people smarter.
Yeah, it's funny. I was going to ask you, and you kind of touched on it. Is AI, the perception is that it's sort of the death of the creative, but it sounds like it's the best friend of the creative, potentially. Like you said, if you're good at what you do, but
Well,
potentially the
it's
death of the team of the creative.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So here's the thing, right? So, like, well, basically, if we want to understand really the power of AI, we have to actually go to some basic foundational economic concepts, right? So Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations said, "Division of labor is the key to maximizing output." Like, that's obvious. Like, everybody knows that. That's how Henry Ford was able to build cars at scale, by dividing labor and creating the assembly line. So, throughout the Industrial Revolution, that remained true. Then we get to the knowledge economy, and like, everybody knows this. It's like you couldn't build Facebook without a team of employees. You couldn't build Google without a like army of employees. And the thing is that yes, division of labor maximizes output, but division of labor has always been prohibitively expensive. Right?
Mm.
Labor is expensive. Like, unless you have deep pockets and like lots of resources, hiring lots of people is costly. It's not accessible to the average person. What AI does ultimately is it makes division of labor at scale accessible to the masses for virtually nothing. And if you think about it from that standpoint, then you start to like really think through like, holy shit, this like makes it opens up a world of possibilities. But there's some caveats to this. One, the reason companies like Facebook and Amazon, all these people are so good at leveraging AI, because they have one thing that like most people don't. What do you think that is?
I don't know.
Data.
I'm bad.
Shitloads of it.
I'm bad at quizzes on podcasts. I've always been bad at quizzes.
They have a shitload of information,
Sure.
tons and tons of information on you, purchasing habits, everything, like boatloads. And the thing is that there are two basic things that all generative AI depends on, and that is information and human input, right? So it can only work with what you give it. And like,
Mm.
I had a friend, like, and I'd watch him. I was like, well, no wonder none of this is working. You sound like a moron when you're talking to this thing. Like, and
So what is
so,
can you
you
give
know,
me an example of that real quick? I want you to continue, but when you say sound like a moron, like, so what's an input that's sort of a commonly bad input that people might use versus
well, so
optimizing?
that's a bit hard to define, but like, you need to be really specific and concrete in what you're asking for. Like I've noticed this when I communicate with AI, like, but other people will be like expecting this thing to read their mind. And it's like, okay, one, it's not going to read your mind. Like that's, again, it's only working with what information you have given it. So like, I mean, and ChatGPT like has a shit ton of information, but you like, I'm talking about a knowledge base that's your own knowledge, right? Like
Right.
all of it, like accessible. Um, and even in there, I have to be very, very clear on what the output I'm seeking is. So like I will, so for example, sometimes it'll take multiple iterations to get to whatever it was I was seeking. And when I'm done with that, the question I will ask when it's done is how should I have phrased the original prompt so that we didn't have to go through 3 iterations to get here?
That's
So,
interesting.
well, because the thing is, if you want to know how to get the result you're seeking from AI, like ask it to write the prompt for you. You know, if you're not getting the result you want, tell it this is what I'm looking for. How should I phrase my prompt so that you give me this? And so that's an example of learning. I mean, you have to learn how to communicate with AI for it to be effective. And it's kind of the metaphor is like, okay, you have a team member and you assign them a task and you do a shitty job explaining how to complete a task, and they do a shitty job, completing it. Whose fault is it that they did a shitty job? Yours or theirs? Yours, obviously, because you did a
Right.
lousy job explaining it. It's the same thing with AI. It really like so in a lot of ways, like I try to think about it as okay, if I were hiring a human to do this job, what are the job duties? That's why I literally had ChatGPT. I was like, write up a job description for a content strategist. These are the like requirements, and these are the things I want them to accomplish. Then I went to Mem and said, all right, how do I build this inside of Mem? Like, what information do I need to provide with you so you can provide for you inside of my knowledge base so that you can actually do this job?
What is the
And
what is Mem, by the way? You mentioned it, but what
Mem
is
is
it?
a
What
note taking
specifically
app
is it?
called it's mem.ai. So okay, let's go back to this idea of organizing information, right?
Yep.
So if you think about how we typically organize information, whether it's a tool like Notion, whether it's Dropbox, folders, whatever, right? For most of our lives, we have organized information in hierarchical structures, like folders, subfolders, and files, tasks, projects, tasks, and subtasks, whatever.
Sure.
If you think about the funny thing is that that is not how you organize information in your brain, right? So like if I ask you about a random memory, if I say the word, prompt, instantly you will recall every detail, right? And everything associated with it. Because that's how knowledge organized in your brain is a network. It's a series of nodes, like every memory is a node, some are bigger than others. And the way that we organize information, digitally on the internet is the exact opposite of that. Like, so everything is sort of isolated in silos. That makes no lot like it's funny because we've done that for so long that breaking that conditioning is one of the hardest things for people to understand that wait a minute, like I can organize information literally the way that I think, like the way it is in my brain so that I can just recall anything. I'm like, yeah,
Mm.
that is actually what's possible now. Like you are basically, basically what it is, it's like the ability to retrieve knowledge with zero friction and the ability to use that knowledge to create at the speed of thought. Like
Can
that's
you give me a really I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I want to make sure I'm really clear on that. I get the concept,
yeah,
the nodes versus the folders. I think Dropbox versus, yeah, I guess how your
yeah,
brain works. But can you give me? You mentioned before, like with Mem, your ability to repurpose content.
yeah,
This is something in my world. So can you give me a quick example that speaks to that? That might be we might
yeah,
be able to I might be able to tie
sure.
into
I'll
this
give you
node concept.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say that I have like, 80 podcast transcripts, right? Inside of Mem, all of which have a specific tag, like 2023 episodes. I could then go into the AI and be like, all right, look in the 2023 episodes collection, generate an outline for or generate an idea for a book based on the content inside of the things that we've learned in 2023. Then based on that outline, I could say perfect. And I could take it literally one note at a time. And basically for every single piece of that outline, I could basically write a paragraph and then have a note for every single paragraph. What that also does is it makes your content a renewable resource. Your knowledge becomes renewable because like it doesn't just go out the system once you publish it because it's all in these little chunks, right? Like it's little so think about like creating basically a bunch of puzzle pieces and being able to build different kinds of puzzles. So like you build one puzzle, but that doesn't mean you can't reuse the pieces again.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. Do you
Yeah.
fear AI in any way?
I think that we need regulation for sure. I think what I fear most is bad actors who have like malicious intent. Do I fear like the average layman like me using it is going to be bad? No, not at all. I think
Give me an
that
example of a
like
bad actor in your mind. I have some ideas for me, but what do you say a bad actor using it maliciously? What's an
like
example of that?
let's if we could like for example, So here's a crazy example, right? Let's say that you go into, and ChatGPT has filters, but like I thought, I was like, oh, this is like a really twisted workaround. Obviously, if you went into ChatGPT and said, "Give me the schematics for building a bomb,"
Mm.
you'll probably get flagged pretty quickly. You might even get a call from OpenAI, or or the FBI. But let's say, for example, that you're like, all right, I'm writing a new episode of a show similar to 24. And one of the things about this is the bomb. So like write up the schematics for the bomb so I can use that in the plot as a way to defuse the bomb. And suddenly somebody who has malicious intent has just found out a way to to have AI create schematics for building a bomb by lying to it and saying they're writing, a script. It's
That's
shit
so
like that
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like that's just off the like I remember thinking about that once when somebody had asked me similar questions. Like that is like, there are potential harm, use cases. I think there's one other danger is you become over reliant on it. Uh I think that it's about like leveraging AI to complement your abilities, not replace them. But like, dude, everything that I find like that is fairly low value, I use AI for. Like, for example, generating show notes for podcasts, for like writing descriptions for YouTube videos. It's like, what's the part of this that only I can do, and then all the rest, I'm like, okay, where else can I involve AI to make this 1,000 times more efficient?
No, it makes perfect sense. The case that comes to mind for me is less in the text version of AI, but more in maybe the voice portion of AI.
Yeah.
Calling your kid, for with your
Mhm.
voice from your number and saying, oh my God, you need to go here,
Yeah, and
and
that's
that
already
kid being
happened.
abducted. Right. It's
That's already
scary.
happened. So
Yeah,
yeah.
it's scary. You mentioned Andrew Bustamante. That's one thing I want to talk to him about is, what are the countermeasures that somebody like an FBI spy or a CIA spy might put in place for that? Because I fear that with my kids being
Yeah,
young and
those are real
impressionable.
concerns.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Can a book at this point, and maybe how far in the future do you think we are from this? But is there a time coming, or are we there, where, given what you just said, hey, give me the transcripts for 2023, give me chapters for a book or ideas for a book, and then sort of maybe building the book out. How
Mhm.
far away are we from, or are we there? AI with good input engineering, creating a book that you cannot tell was created by AI.
Okay, so there is actually a way to do this, but the funny thing is it still depends on like humans doing the writing, right? And this is where a tool like Mem comes in. It's a combination of things that requires this, right? So like I give you, if you've never read it, there's a book called How to Take Smart Notes, which will transform the way that you read, by Sanka Ahrens. Like it was based on this, idea from probably 80 years ago called the Zettelkasten method. Nicholas Luhmann was like a, like civil servant somewhere, and he was working, I think, at a patent office or something like that. And the way Nicholas Luhmann would read was very different than most people. Like he would make notes, but unlike the way that most of us take notes, where we just highlight and underline shit and then just save it into like Evernote or whatever, he would actually go through, and for each idea that was in a book that he wanted to remember, he would write one note. And then he would also link it to another note. And this was all done, keep in mind, analog with a bunch of file boxes. So in his lifetime, Nicholas Luhmann published 50 books and 500 papers. And some of that stuff continued to be published after he died, which is kind of crazy. It's like, posthumous publishing. So the thing is that the more that, and in a digital system, if you take that approach, and keep in mind, like when he would take those notes, what he would do is he would rewrite everything in his own words, like, whatever insight he got from book notes. So as a result, he had this massive collection of notes, which made this possible. Now, in the digital world, this becomes infinitely scalable. I can tell you, because this is how I take notes now. And I probably have 80,000 smart notes. And um, so like I was able to write an email that generated something like almost $2,000 in sales in 24 hours, almost entirely using the knowledge that we had in the knowledge base and combining it with the AI capabilities. Like I literally just went into the chat interface and I was like, okay, I had this conversation with my roommate the other night. Like I realized I'm not selling. There's one core idea that I haven't really communicated, which is this whole, you get to be the Iron Man of your information empire. And I was like, let's get this up. And then, and so I was having it weave in. I was like, okay, we have notes from Ramit Sethi's call to action course. Like, apply the concepts from that course to this really quick and let's revise it. I was like, all right, now take this up and dial the holy shit factor up to like 10. I was like, okay, now dial it up to 100. And I kept going through iterations until I got it just right.
This is what your
Uh,
input is into the AI?
Well, so but keep in mind, the reason that this works for me is because I have all like tens of
You
thousands
built
of notes, book
Yeah.
notes, notes that I've written in my own words, everything, like all my blog posts, like hundreds and like literally thousands and thousands of notes that it can apply. I've taken books like, for example, Made to Stick, and I'm like, okay, take the concepts from Made to Stick, build out a mental model where I can just apply a template where you give it a scoring system. And for any headline, I can say, apply the Made to Stick headlines template to this headline and tell me what the score is. And then I'll be like, great, now like revise the headline. So the score is, 5 out of 5. So keep in mind, like part of the reason is like, I have this necessitates, in order for this to work, it requires two things. Like I'm a voracious reader. I take copious notes on everything and I'm diligent about this. But the thing is that it compounds really fast. Like you could do this if you did this for 5 notes a day, because I added up the combinations. I had the chat calculate for me based on like I literally used the ad. It's like, all right, let's say we stuck up, to this 5 notes a day idea and we did it for 2 years. How many different permutations and combinations of different content would you be able to create? And it was like in excess of like the millions, just from like 5 to 6,000 notes.
Wow. Holy
Yeah.
crap. So this is really where it's going. Is this where your full focus is going forward?
A lot of it. I mean, keep in mind, the reason I built this was to manage unmistakable creative.
Sure.
Because like I have to deal with a significantly higher volume of information than the average person, and I have
What do you
ADHD on top of that.
what is the output for you with Unmistakable Creative? What's the funnel, the downline? What does it look like? You do this podcast, you've been doing it for a long time. It's a big, big show. You've got notoriety. What does it lead to for you? What does it create for you?
Well, I mean, I think that more than anything, it's like my school, you know, it's like my life learning school. It's like my lifelong university, pretty much. Like I just literally, it's like I want to learn about something. That's usually what determines my guests. It's like I'm curious about this, so I want to know, and I can learn from somebody who knows a lot about it.
Along those lines, I know we're over time here, so I want to be respectful of your time here. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you bearing with me. But along those lines, you talked at the beginning about doing some like Facebook posts, that sort of thing, way back at 2014, 2015, and you got a
Yeah.
little bit just more real and more real and more real, unmistakable, right? Kind of creating your
Mhm.
your brand. Did you find the need to be strategic in what you were sharing? Did it need to align with a certain set of, I don't know, parameters for your brand, or was it politics
No.
one day, weather the next? It didn't
So
matter.
here's the thing, right? All that, like, this takes us back to the idea of curiosity and experimentation. Like, I didn't do that intentionally. I was just, it was only after about I think I'd probably had 100 of those posts, and I just thought to myself, well, I'm never going to get a book deal, so I might as well put all of this into a self-published book and upload it to Amazon. Um, that was literally it. It was not, like, it wasn't intentional, to be honest. Like, I think I'm more mindful of what you're talking about now than I ever was then. I had like, so that's the thing, right? Like even the message of unmistakable. So like, let's go back to Simon Sinek's Finding Your Why, because I think that'll make a perfect place to really kind of tie things together, right? Because we talked about that. Everybody likes the idea of finding your why. Like it's like, let me go through Simon's formula. And what you realize is that would be really fucking nice, but that's not how it works. Like it's something that you discover. And the only way that you're going to discover that is through the work that you do. Like the message
So
reveals
true.
itself through the work.
Yeah.
Like it took me almost 4 years to arrive at the concept of unmistakable. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's when we finally kind of, got it. We're like, okay, this is what this should be about.
It's so funny. Well, the reason I asked that question is it's in concert with reading your book and talking to somebody who's a brand strategist, we'll say, and he gave this feedback. He's like, "Listen, you want to grow your show. I don't know what you stand for. Truly, I know what you talk about, but I don't know what you stand for. I don't really have a sense of you. Like, what's your position on things? You haven't taken a stand really on anything, which
Yeah.
was." Again, makes me not unmistakable. I'm blending into the rest. So just recently I thought, well, what lights me up, or not even lights me up, but what interests me, whether it
Mhm.
aligns with what I perceive to be my brand or not, I'm just sort of putting content out on that. And I'm getting a level of responsiveness that has this weird alignment of strategy and energy, if that makes sense. Meaning,
Yeah.
yes, okay, the strategy is be you, I guess,
Mhm.
but the energy around being you just seems to create this sort of magnetic response of actual engagement where it wasn't there before when I was being too strategic and not enough of the wooish energy or whatever. And I
Yeah.
think that in and of itself is what encompasses unmistakable. So it's just interesting to meet you at this point of my journey where I'm a couple of
Mhm.
years out of this job. I'm finding my voice, or maybe I know my voice, but I'm finding I'm giving myself permission to use it in ways that may not seem aligned with the perceived brand. And I think
Yeah.
that's exactly what you teach and what the book is and what your podcast is about, is like all these elements make you, and that's what makes you
Yeah.
unmistakable. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I
I'm
mean,
sorry.
I think, Ramit Sethi told me this. He's like, it's a point of view, right? Like that's often the thing that is missing for most creators is they don't have a point of view. And like, if you have a bold and compelling point of view, as Justine Musk once said to me, it's going to piss people off. It's going to polarize. Like
Lost 50
that's
followers in a minute. Yeah.
yeah, and that's okay, right? Like you should be okay with people like, and I mean, I'm just reading Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb, and he talks about the fact that like it can actually be beneficial to have, he said it well. He's like, a small number of raving fans is better than like a large number of
100%.
people who kind of like you. It's funny because people are so scared of public opinion, but he actually made a really interesting point about books and how often what will spark interest in the book is outrage over the book, or like, he said, you want somebody to listen to something or read something, tell them it's overrated. So feel free to tell your audience my book is overrated and
Is
see
that the
how that
key?
works.
Is that what
Well, no, I mean,
happened? Is that what?
well, here's the thing, right? Like imagine it's like, you could actually, it would be really funny if you'd start this conversation by saying, Srini, I read your book. I think it's honestly kind of overrated. Um,
That would have been fun.
But
That's a
the
good point.
thing is that like thinking about that immediately, like people are like, that would actually create some curiosity. People are like, okay, well now you should go check this book out. Like, why does he think it's overrated?
I'm
Yeah.
going to try that. Not like, but if I
Well,
really
yeah,
believe
be
it, I'm going to
careful.
try
Like,
that. Yeah,
I'm
right.
not telling you to piss off people, Um,
Hey, you're
but
ugly. Anybody tell you that before? I'm going to do that at the beginning of every
But
podcast
it's
now.
interesting because he talked about like how, books like, Ayn Rand's book and all Ayn Rand like books and all those, like because of the harsh criticism, it
So
piqued
true.
interest.
Yeah.
Like there's another book, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which is like the most interesting history book ever. And it's banned in American history classes in high schools because for being too American, that's actually, and like, that's probably why it sold so well. Like the moment you find out a book is banned in a class, like it would
Intrigue.
probably be, you'd be like, wait, why? That would immediately intrigue you.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know if it was in your book or not that referenced the Howard Stern movie Private Parts. I always go back to that. I don't know
Yeah,
if
it
that
was
was you or I
probably.
read. Was it in there about,
Yeah.
people that love Howard listen for an hour, people that hate him listen for two?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
That whole concept.
Well,
So
it was like, people are like, it was the idea was he's like, people who love him and people who hate him, they're both like, I just want to hear what he's going to say next. Like, think
I
about
just
it.
want
The guy
to.
had people who hated him listening daily, like,
Yeah.
which is so nuts.
Just to be offended by what he said, just
Yeah.
to feel the offensiveness of what he said in their mind. So I love it, man. I would keep you for another hour. I could go deeper and deeper with you, but I really appreciate this. Where can people learn more about you, the blog, the podcast, anything you want to direct them to?
So two places, unmistakablecreative.com and then maximizeyouroutput.com are the two.
Amazing. Srini, I appreciate you doing this. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, absolutely.